As the opening scene of this 1946 independent production warns of stormy weather ahead, let me introduce myself. My name is Bernie Prokop, Associate Professor of English and Curator of Colorado Christian University's film series. A film fan, buff, and scholar all rolled into one, I have come to develop a soft spot for this movie, which hopefully will reach a larger audience through this new 2K scan release. My hope is to place The Strange Woman into several different contexts: historical, cultural, artistic, and professional, while at the same time providing a more nuanced understanding of its star and producer, the beguiling Hedy Lamarr. But first, a few broad notes on the film itself. In a book from 2009, a critical retrospective of director Edgar G. Ulmer's films, critic Elena Smirskova comments that The Strange Woman is, quote, among the most neglected and least discussed of his works. By the way, Smirskova is a Slovakian film scholar, which is a fitting coincidence considering both Ulmer's and Lamarr's Central European roots, a fact I'll dissect and analyze throughout this commentary. In addition, the essay from which this opinion comes is entitled Ulmer and the Noir Femme Fatale, highlighting another notion I'll take up with reference to The Strange Woman and its heroine, Jenny Hager. But I would agree with Ms. Smirskova's assertion. This movie has for too long been overlooked, both in its relations to its cult director and his glamorous but misunderstood star.
Poster, nothing but money.
I've been sorry for him ever since his wife ran off with that lieutenant.
If he'd spent less on whiskey, he wouldn't have lost his wife. Let me show you another piece.
Drunk or sober, Ma would have left him anyhow. She was that kind.
Yeah, how do you like that for quality, huh?
Let him have it.
Very well, Tim Hager. You'll have your whiskey. But this is the last time...
All right, Poster, no preaching.
It's his little girl I feel sorry for. Poor little Jenny Hager.
Before her first appearance on screen and diving into Lamarr's outsized role in the making of this film, however, let's begin with some interesting trivia about this scene, the film's second, in which our strange woman is painted as a rather malicious and manipulative little girl. The sequence is quite effective, and the child actress does a wonderful job establishing Jenny's dual nature. However, this is not the original version of the scene. Initially, it was shot by the movie's credited director, Edgar G. Ulmer, and featured his own 9-year-old daughter, Ariane. But Hunt Stromberg and Lamarr, wearing her producer's hat, deemed the footage lacking in nastiness. So a recently emigrated Douglas Sirk was enlisted to shoot the scene again, this time with Joanne Marlowe playing Jenny. Sirk's name might be familiar to film buffs. Born Hans Detlef Sirk, he was a successful German director, married to a Jew who fled the Nazis. In 1937, by the way, the same year Hedy Kiesler would sneak out of her Vienna mansion, and went on to make several now legendary melodramas of the 1950s. Films like Magnificent Obsession and one of my all-time favorites, All That Heaven Allows. The mere fact that you have 3 Central European immigrants playing key roles in this independent Hollywood production only serves to emphasize just how significant the contributions of the émigré community were to the vitality and quality of American cinema in the 1940s. And isn't little Joanne brilliant in her turn as the young Jenny? Definitely more than nasty enough. Marlowe appeared in 2 classics before her brief turn here, Yankee Doodle Dandy and Mildred Pierce, in which she played Joan Crawford's younger daughter. The onset of adolescence would end her acting career, a common occurrence for child actors in all eras, I'm afraid. She goes on to be a bit of a pioneer herself in another field, however, serving as the chief trial lawyer for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles in the early 1960s. But then, Sadly and bizarrely, she would end her life in a coma for 22 years following a cerebral hemorrhage.
All right. He is your father, at least in the eyes of the law. Now, you look after that girl of yours, Tim Hager, and stop being a disgrace to Bangor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Drive on. Now, young poster, we'll take you to your father's store.
That tight-fisted, sour-blooded old skinflint. You might be better off with Mrs. Saladine, Jenny.
Not in Mrs. Saladine's kitchen.
I've no money to bring you up properly.
Never mind. Before long, we'll have everything. Houses and carriages, horses and kitchen maids.
All those things, my lass. You're a wee bit young.
Just as soon as I grow up, we'll have everything we want. Because I'm going to be beautiful.
Empty. Beautiful.
I'm not sure whether the conclusion of this scene is Sirk's or Ulmer's work, but what a great transition from the young Jenny to the grown-up version. The means of this transition is the whiskey jug her father hoists into the water, an economical visual comment on how his drunkenness will fracture the girl's rosy reflection of her future. An endless stream of everything, as she puts it, while both vainly and seductively twirling her hair around her finger. The Hagers apparently will have houses and carriages, horses and housemaids. Following the splashing of her vision in the water, one also can't help but be reminded of the myth of Narcissus falling in love with his own reflection in a pool. There's a quick dissolve, and we've traveled several years and are introduced to Jenny the woman. It's quite a spectacular arrival on screen, as the feminine Narcissus rises, provocatively smooths her dress, and lustily races into town, pausing briefly for us viewers to get a good look at her. That's Hedy Lamarr, we can imagine those 1946 viewers would have exclaimed to themselves in the darkened movie house. The name of Hedy Lamarr is a legendary one in Hollywood lore, but as is the case with the majority of popularized history, this Vienna émigré story is both more fascinating and complex when examined in more careful detail. Known in her own time as the most beautiful woman in the world, Lamarr today is perhaps better recognized in the pop culture imagination as a punchline provided to two of the 20th century's most gifted comedians, Lucille Ball and Mel Brooks. Beginning in the 1960s, Ball performed a hilarious impersonation of Lamarr as the exotic seductress of 1942's White Cargo, a film whose only purpose, seemingly, was to create an excuse for the female lead to show some bronzed skin and undulate before a series of sweaty white men in the jungles of West Africa. Described in the movie as being half Egyptian, half Arab, Lamarr's Tondaleo is quite the minx, a sort of native femme fatale who lures otherwise civilized men to their moral and mortal doom. In Ball's deft comic hands, Tondaleo is exaggerated to ridiculous proportions. Done up in a costume more Carmen Miranda than Arab Egyptian, Ball awkwardly struts around and glares at her prey and utters her famous catchphrase, "I am Tondaleo." Mel Brooks's nod to his youthful self's fantasy girl. In interviews, he has claimed Hedy Lamarr as one of his primary inspirations and, quote, the best-looking movie star that ever lived, end quote, is both more subtle and gentler. Harvey Korman's sniveling con man in Blazing Saddles is named Hedy Lamarr, but is constantly called Hedy. It is an unusual name, to be sure, but it is not a stage one. Hedy is short for Hedwig, an ancient Germanic name which combines the words for battle and duel. And this is fitting, considering Hedwig Kiesler's life. By 31, her age at the making of this film, Hedy had worn several masks and lived several lives already. Bohemian artist, tempting trophy wife, and Hollywood sex symbol. See my essay for more details about Lamarr's life before her immigration to America. That latter iteration, sex symbol, was particularly vexing for the witty and intelligent actress. More on that striking intelligence a bit later. For now, suffice it to say that by the mid-1940s, Hedy had been married 3 times, had 2 children, and knew she was capable of so much more than playing the Tondaleos of the world. Having already escaped war-torn Europe, by 1946 she wanted out of her studio-built cage and would soon fly its coop. As she put it herself in a newspaper interview of the time, quote, "I've been everything, but I've never been me." Much like Hedy herself, Hunt Stromberg had fled the studio system, leaving MGM, Hedy's own studio, in 1942 to form his own production company. His first independent release was the fantastic Barbara Stanwyck vehicle, The Lady of Burlesque. The Strange Woman was Hunt Stromberg Productions' 4th film, but the first with a woman producer at the helm. This was 2 years before Ida Lupino, the woman traditionally hailed as the first female film producer, formed her company, The Filmmakers Incorporated. Robert Osborne, the longtime on-camera face of Turner Classic Movies and a close friend of Lamarr's later in her life, doesn't believe any woman before her had done what Hedy managed to do in the summer of 1946. Unfortunately, that artistic freedom was short-lived and will be detailed later in this commentary. Besides Hunt Stromberg Productions, the other entity behind the making of the film was Mars Productions, founded by Lamarr herself just a year prior, in 1945. The name itself has significance, it seems to me, Mars being both a bright object in the heavens as well as the god of war. It also recalls associations with Hedy's former employer, MGM Studio. While its official motto was Ars Gratias Artis, the rather pretentious art for art's sake, MGM consistently boasted in the 30s and 40s that the studio had, quote, more stars than there are in the heavens. Moreover, one of the most iconic images of Lamarr comes from the MGM production of The Ziegfeld Girl in 1941. The so-called star gown, designed by the legendary Adrian, whose real last name was the less mysterious and more obviously Jewish Greenberg. Hedy appears in the shimmering white and gold gown in a musical number, striding, rather awkwardly if you ask me, up a staircase, her head encased by a mobile-like structure with silver stars attached to its wires, while crooner Tony Martin sings, "You Stepped Out of a Dream." In becoming the boss lady of her own independent production company and naming it Mars, Lamarr was clearly stepping out of the manufactured dream of the MGM Fantasy Factory and staking a claim to her own professional life. The Strange Woman was released by United Artists, a company indelibly linked to artistic independence, having originally been 3/4 formed by early Hollywood actors, namely Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford, who desired control over their own movies. The vehicle for Lamarr's first foray into producing would be an adaptation of a best-selling novel from 2 years earlier. Ben Ames Williams's 19th century tale of Jenny Hager, following her from childhood through 2 marriages and plenty of intrigue, is over 600 pages and structured around the heroine's men in her life, starting with her drunken father, Tim. Especially in its treatment of this foundational relationship, the novel is rather daring. While never explicitly describing incest, Williams intimates that Jenny is both well aware of the desire her blossoming body inspires in her father and more than willing to use it to her advantage. Tim Hager comes off much more morally tortured in the novel than he does in his relatively small role in the movie. As played by British actor Dennis Hoey, Tim's main purpose is to identify Jenny as a wanton and then attempt to beat the devil out of her, thus sending her fleeing into the night to Isaiah Poster's house.
So that I couldn't move. And then he beat me until I thought Look at my back. Oh, I can't go back there. I can't. He's going to kill me.
You're not going anywhere until you're healed and sound again. Now you get out of these things while I heat up some water. You'll be as good as new and just... Yes, Mr. Poster. Something you wanted?
This sequence of Jenny's escape demonstrates Lamarr's underrated talents as an actress, and it ends with a really nice overhead shot as Isaiah closes the door on Jenny, essentially locking her into his house and signifying her as a kept woman. But he's trapped too, in his own lust for the younger woman.
Tavern keeper out of town and into the river. If I had my way...
We ought to be deciding about the girl, Deacon Adams. There's been enough scourging for one night.
One thing is decided. The girl mustn't go back to her father.
No, someone must take her in. I would, only my daughter Mary doesn't like the poor girl.
Then she's not for your house, Reverend.
One aspect that the novel expounds upon that is barely touched on in the film version is the physical location of its action. The book includes a great deal of discussion of Maine's economy and its primary resource, pine forests. While we know what kind of business the elder Poster has made his fortune in, the movie is much more concerned with the various webs Jenny weaves to trap the men she meets. Of course, part of the reason for avoiding much on-screen treatment of Maine, its pine forests or logging industry, is that Lamarr and Ulmer had little in the way of resources to recreate such a setting. The only scene taking place outside the boundaries of the town of Bangor, the canoe trip down some rapids during which Ephraim ends up killing his father, very much betrays the relatively, especially by picture standards of the time, limited budget for the production. Another of Williams's novels, actually purchased by 20th Century Fox even before it was published, was made less than a year earlier into a much better-known film, Leave Her to Heaven, which has since earned a cult following and was named to the National Film Registry in 2018. Often cited by critics for its blurring of genre lines, one can see the same process occurring in The Strange Woman. Might Jenny Hager be considered a femme fatale? Well, yes and no, and part of that answer stems from Hedy Lamarr's subtle portrayal of the titular character. Unlike Jean Tierney in Leave Her to Heaven, Lamarr brings out a more conflicted side to Jenny. She simply is a more nuanced character, and this can be perceived from differences in the two novels. For example, Tierney's Ellen uses pregnancy as a means of emotional manipulation of her husband, then throws herself down a flight of stairs to induce a miscarriage. Jenny, on the other hand, during The Strange Woman, is told of her infertility, which, it is implied, leads to feelings of unworthiness and, perhaps, can explain in part her reckless actions and eventual death at the end of the movie.
You'd be free. An intelligent girl thinks of the future when she chooses a husband. I could marry you to each other right now, Jenny.
And you'd be a rich woman.
It's for you to decide.
After becoming Mrs. Isaiah Poster, this scene, in which Jenny composes a letter to her son, exposes the incestual nature of her desire, and it's worth quoting at length here.
And when my father died, I turned to the only friend I had, Mr. Poster, giving you a nice young mother. Think of all that means, Ephraim. You must learn to say yes, ma'am, like a proper son, because I shall demand obedience and love. And if you refuse, my dear son, I shall punish you by not kissing you goodnight. Now, Ephraim, do come home and see what a fine parent I can be. I do think families should be close, don't you?
Moreover, consider the message being sent by Lamarr's costuming in this scene. She is dressed more as a coquettish young girl than a matron, with her white frilled dress and ribbons in her hair. Even more telling, but more subtle, is the way Jenny fondles the letter itself as she speaks to Meg Saladine about, quote, just ordering something from Boston, something to brighten up the house, end quote. Say, a young stepson to seduce? This very next scene further develops the dual nature within Jenny. The prim and proper Meg Saladine, daughter of the town's judge, is instructing the new Mrs. Poster on how a lady sets a table. But Jenny is frustrated. She tells Meg about Cleopatra, not exactly a lady, and how, quote, it wasn't knowing about setting a table that she got along. A few seconds later, Jenny has her own opinion regarding what is true about men and women. Plain talk, as she calls it. Meg wishes to get John Everett to propose to her, but doesn't know how to do it. However, Jenny does. In true Cleopatra fashion, she boasts, I wouldn't give him time to think. Interesting, too, is the biblical allusion contained in the title of the Lamarr picture. It comes from the book of Proverbs. Digging a little deeper into the scriptural story of the strange woman and its historical context reveals some interesting parallels to Hedy Lamarr's life and career. Biblical scholars have identified the loose woman being described in Proverbs, and to whom the fire and brimstone preacher alludes in his Jeremiad at the end of the movie, to not only an adulterous woman who intends to trap a son, but also a foreign or socially unacceptable Jewish woman, unfit for the elite Jews recently returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, the adulterous woman entrapping a son is clearly what happens in the plot of The Strange Woman. Jenny does indeed seduce her son, at least considered so by marriage, Ephraim Poster, into murdering his father, albeit not intentionally. However, when viewed through the lens of Lamarr's early life in Europe and her American experience under Louis B. Mayer at MGM, the context becomes even more fascinating. The truth is that Hedwig Kiesler was Jewish. Like Louis B. Mayer and most of the studio heads in the golden age of Hollywood. While she was a member of a wealthy, non-practicing, and fully assimilated family of interwar Austrian society, such distinctions would become irrelevant once the Nazis came to power in 1933. Ironically, this was the same year that a 19-year-old Hedy Kiesler would appear in the scandalous movie Ecstasy, a film which Hitler would ban within the borders of the Third Reich, not due to its lurid subject matter, but because its female lead was a Jewess. For quite different reasons, Mayer may have considered Hedy less than acceptable for anything other than playing strange women. So again, we see how the movie takes on some provocative connotations against the backdrop of its producer and star's life.
Mr. Clayton, this is intolerable. If you have no feeling for your fellow men, at least take some interest in the welfare of your own children. Grog shops and low houses cover every inch of our waterfront. Our wealth is poured into Devil's Half-Acre. And our young men, your sons, have nowhere else to go. Give me a bigger church, and I'll keep them here. Will no one pledge to the church more than just enough to save his face?
Mr. and Mrs. Isaiah Poster will contribute $1,000.
If the men of Bangor won't give to the church, the women will.
Mr. and Mrs. Partridge pledge $500.
Judge Saladine will pledge $1,000.
Jenny, I want you to go on working for the church. A church can endure only upon deeds and not lip service.
I'd say her lips have done you enough service. $1,000. If you think I've so much money, you ought to...
Stop it, Isaiah. You're the luckiest man in Bangor.
Oh, Mrs. Post, I'm so glad to see the younger members taking an interest in the church, and I must apologize for not calling on you directly after you were married.
That was a wonderful contribution, Jenny.
He's a wonderful husband to let me make it.
Good morning.
Good day, Reverend.
Good day, Reverend. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
It ain't the money of mine, but I'd like to know what you're doing with it before you do it.
I gave the money because I hate grog shops and what they do to people.
How are you, Father? Hello, Mother.
My name's still Jenny.
You came home, did you? I thought you'd be on your way to England or somewhere by now.
Oh, England is full of architects.
I knew you'd come home. Isaiah told me he sent you money to travel for a while, but I didn't think you would.
I came close to it. I didn't know whether to mind your letter or mind his and go away.
It's easy to see which one you thought more of. Now, why do we stand here? Let's go in or out. And let me do the writing to my son.
Mr. Ephraim. My Mr. Ephraim. Why, you've grown as much as you ever will, haven't you?
Oh, I'm stunted. They don't know how to bake an apple pie in Cambridge.
You'll have one every day if only you'll stay here.
He'll stay.
Lamarr's choice of directors is also worth taking a closer look at. Edgar G. Ulmer, that middle initial, by the way, does not appear in the credits of The Strange Woman, but his name nearly always includes it in other credits, and certainly is never omitted in the large number of monographs, books, and documentaries dedicated to his life and work following his death. Ulmer is a bizarre, almost phantom-like presence in film history, and is best known for a film made the year prior to this one. Critics and film historians have elevated that movie, Detour, to legendary status. It is most frequently lauded as somewhere near the platonic ideal of both the noir film genre and the artistic fruits of filmmaking on a shoestring budget. In fact, the $1.5 million budget of The Strange Woman, that's almost $25 million today, was more than likely the largest one Ulmer ever got to expend on a production. Known as the King of Poverty Row, Ulmer had as varied and unusual a pre-Hollywood life as Lamarr. Like Lamarr, he was Jewish and born in Central Europe. In Ulmer's case, the Austria-Hungarian town of Olomouc, in what is now the Czech Republic. Also, like Hedy Lamarr, Ulmer would come to regard Vienna as his hometown, moving there early in his life to pursue his artistic dreams. However, here is where the evidence gets hazy. From an early age, Edgar was a serial fabulist, inventing associations that were probably never real with early German filmmakers and iconic films. For example, he often told others, in particular Peter Bogdanovich, who interviewed him in 1970, that he was part of the crew which made two iconic German expressionist works, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Golem. Most likely this is a case of fable-making, because Ulmer would have been around 16 years old at the time. However, what cannot be doubted is his association with the legendary theatrical director Max Reinhardt and the filmmaker F.W. Murnau. He designed sets for Reinhardt and assisted in art direction for Murnau's initial foray into Hollywood, the gorgeously artsy Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, a late silent production released in the watershed year of 1927. Another film that Ulmer was involved in, this time back in Europe, was People on Sunday, the last German silent film. Groundbreaking for its time, it was subtitled as a film without actors and could be considered neo-realist 20 years before that term was coined and became linked to Italian cinema after World War II. Filmed literally in the streets of Berlin, the plot, such as it is, follows two young couples as they meet, flirt, and enjoy a free Sunday in an interwar Germany before Adolf Hitler rose to power. It's a charming photographic time capsule, unlike anything that was being made in Germany at the time, and especially noteworthy because it launched the careers of at least three men who would become architects of the Hollywood style of the Golden Age. The least known of these artists was Robert Siodmak, a director who would end up making 23 films, including, not surprisingly, a good number of noirs, the best remembered of those being The Killers, released the same year as this film, and The File on Thelma Jordan. The second of the trio was Fred Zinnemann, who served as a cameraman on People on Sunday, and would go on to an even more distinguished Hollywood career than Siodmak, and one that lasted well into the 1970s. Among the most accomplished of Zinnemann's works would be the masterpiece High Noon, as well as From Here to Eternity, Oklahoma, and A Man for All Seasons. Yet the artist who would end up making the biggest mark of the Young Turks that made People on Sunday in the Berlin summer of 1929 was Billy Wilder. His contribution to the movie is disputed. Siodmak would later claim that he spent all of a few minutes on the script, but he was definitely present at its creation. Obviously, Wilder would become a legend once in Hollywood, responsible for some of my fondest film-going experiences. First as screenwriter, his Ball of Fire is sheer joy, and later writer-director, Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, and The Apartment, to name the cream of a very large crop. But returning to Ulmer and the cultural and artistic milieu from which he emerged, the timing never fails to amaze me. Within less than a decade, say 1927 to 1937, and out of a relatively small geographical area, the cultural capitals of Vienna and Berlin, surfaced the vital center of the off-screen talent that would create the classic Hollywood style. And they were all Jewish, like their bosses at the studios. What Hitler had pushed out, the U.S. took in and put to work, to the great benefit of film lovers everywhere. Some of these émigrés worked more than others, however, and Edgar G. Ulmer's experience is illustrative. One of the director's more provocative movies is a pre-code exploitation film entitled Damaged Lives. Funded by the Canadian Social Health Council, of all things, it tells the story of a married man who contracts syphilis and gives it to his wife and baby. It is after this production that Ulmer gets his big break at a Hollywood studio. That studio is Universal, headed by, as he was known, Uncle Carl Laemmle, who was, guess what, a German Jewish immigrant, albeit one who arrived in the United States much earlier, 1884 to be exact. Universal was one of the so-called Little Three studios, the other two being Columbia and the aforementioned United Artists, but one that had established a niche in the market with their horror films of the early 30s. The two most famous of those were, of course, Frankenstein and Dracula, both released in 1931. The Black Cat would pair the two stars of those pictures, Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, for the first time. The script was written principally by Ulmer, but has nothing to do with the Edgar Allan Poe story from which the movie takes its title. Instead, its disquieting plot and look recalls a more European sensibility. The film has since acquired the reputation as Ulmer's second greatest work, behind only Detour, and all this achieved with a 15-day shooting schedule and a minuscule budget of $95,000. Both Frankenstein and Dracula had 4 times the budgets and shooting days. It ended up being the highest grossing film of that year for Universal. So how is it that Ulmer didn't get even more opportunities from the studio? Well, the story is this. A certain Shirley Alexander entered the picture. Alexander was her married name, for her husband was Max Alexander, a minor producer at Universal and, much more importantly, the nephew of Uncle Carl Laemmle. The young Shirley is wooed by the older Ulmer, leaves Max, and takes up with the foreign director. This serves to blacklist Ulmer at Universal, despite the Black Cat's critical and box office success. Now, whether Ulmer was a long-suffering victim of his passion for a married and connected woman, or he was simply a maverick artist who preferred to exist on the margins of the film industry and subsist on poverty wages, is up for debate. And the decade between The Black Cat and The Strange Woman, this film, was spent in the filmmaking wilderness. Ulmer's introduction to movie making on the far margins was in the form of a Ukrainian musical, Natalka Poltavka, in 1937, and shot for $18,000 in a Ukrainian village constructed overnight in the backwoods of New Jersey. This led to his meeting members of the Jewish Art Theater, who encouraged Shirley and Edgar to make pictures in Yiddish for the large immigrant community in and around New York City, even though the Ulmers didn't actually speak the language. The first, Green Fields, an adaptation from a stage success, was made on a budget of only $8,000, proving that the King of the Bees could do more with less than any other director in America. Ulmer would go on to another minority group, making so-called race films in the 1930s, including a picture titled Moon Over Harlem. While he is famously quoted as saying, "I did not want to be ground up in the Hollywood hash machine," Ulmer still seemed to desire some level of success on the West Coast, returning to Los Angeles and embarking on the most prolific period of his career, eventually leading to The Strange Woman. Between 1943 and 1946, at the producer's releasing company, the smallest of the Poverty Row studios, Ulmer, alongside Shirley, who helped fashion the scripts, churned out a stream of B pictures, among them Girls in Chains, set in a woman's prison, Her Sister's Secret, the secret being the taboo subject of illegitimacy, Jive Junction, a Second World War propaganda musical, Strange Illusion, a film noir version of Hamlet, and his undisputed masterpiece, Detour, a manic cinematic night ride, fatalistic drama of sex and money.
You keep this up and you'll fall in your tracks. Go to bed, child. Get some rest.
No, I'm strong. Stronger than you think. I'll be all right.
How is he?
Just the same, sir.
Is there any possibility of speaking with him, Jenny? There's trouble in town.
Dr. Mason says warm weather might bring him around. But that's a long way off.
We're at our wits' end. There are too many people in town, too much idleness. Did you hear the shooting last night? That's the sort of thing we're up against. Lumberjacks coming to town between jobs with rum and women on their minds. Told us 2 years ago we should have a police force. We should have listened to him. Well, Jenny, take care of yourself. Meg sends you our love.
They burn to the ground. The taverns and the houses and the people in them.
Judge Saladai.
There you are. Ephraim, I want you to ride to your father's number 3 camp. Tell him we're having a rout, that we need every man down here to keep order till the militia come in.
I can't leave the house.
The Tempest girl stole a lumberjack's wallet. And the drunken fools are firing every tavern in Devil's Half Acre.
I can't go now. Didn't Dr. Mason tell you about Father?
Your father's only one man, Ephraim. We're trying to save the life of the town itself.
What do I care about the town? Maybe it needs a good fire to clean it up.
He'll go. I'll stay with your father, Ephraim.
Hurry, Ephraim. We need those men.
Smoked you out, didn't he? Where's my money?
I didn't take it. I didn't take it.
Where's my money? Let's give her a band. That'll lose their tongue.
Let her go.
Keep out of this, ma'am. People are getting hurt.
I didn't steal his money. He was drunk in the back room. I only came in to take away the glasses. Anyone might have been there before me.
It'll have to be mighty fast to get in a man's pockets before you. $100 a hole when there's work. I say dip her in the river. Come on, what you do with it?
Oh, Jenny, let her go. I'll give you the money.
You're Mrs. Poster.
Yes.
It's nice to meet the gentry, ma'am. But I'm not so sure I'll be happy just to get my money back. We want to know what's going to happen to her.
Since I'm giving you the money, it's my right to decide that.
Why do we gibble and gabble about it? There's the girl, there's the river. Let's give her a bath. Wait. We'll be waiting for your store to open in the morning. If the money isn't there, we're coming up here and collect it.
And all this takes us back to the film you're watching right now, and one Jewish emigre's collaboration with another. Although a Hollywood film being produced by a woman was almost unheard of in 1946, Lamarr could not have picked a better year to put out a release. For the United States was movie mad, and Americans remained more than willing to spend their dollars and cents to sit in front of the silver screen. The Year of the Strange Woman was the single most profitable year for Hollywood up to that time. There were two major reasons for this success. First, movies were still the major affordable entertainment for Americans in 1946, and with World War II over and the baby boom underway, there were even more customers cramming the theaters, which were one of the few public places equipped with air conditioning. The second major reason the studios were flush with cash in 1946 was due to their chokehold on the entertainment market through vertical integration. Because big studios also owned the majority of theaters across the country, if an independent release, such as The Strange Woman, could secure distribution from an outfit like United Artists and get into a block booking deal, there was a decent chance at making a profit. And that is exactly what Lamarr's movie did, pulling in $2.8 million in U.S. rentals against a budget of $1.5 million. Transitioning from the business end of things to the narrative structure of the film, The Strange Woman only further reinforces a conclusion I've reached over the years as I've broadened my viewing of Golden Hollywood's screen stories. Namely, they are consistently, and nearly without exception, more efficiently and powerfully rendered than movies of today. And this includes the work of some of the most talented contemporary filmmakers. In moments in front of classes and in conversation with fellow film lovers, my usual whipping boy is Christopher Nolan, whose films I genuinely admire and enjoy. However, more often than not, I detect a great deal of narrative fat that could be trimmed from his movies. If I were standing in front of the eternal filmic Grand Inquisitor, I would enter into evidence as Exhibit A one of Nolan's more recent and lauded efforts, 2023's Oppenheimer, which garnered universal acclaim and won both the Best Picture Oscar and one for Nolan's direction. Coming in at a whopping 3 hours, one can see this tendency toward what could be kindly categorized as long-form and detailed storytelling, but to my mind is simply a bloated narrative. While I will tip my hat to Nolan's efficiency in other filmmaking elements, for example, Oppenheimer took only 57 days to shoot, the story that shows up on screen is less than tightly constructed. In contrast, screenwriter Herb Meadow and director Ulmer managed to pack a 600-page novel into a mere 100 minutes while still maintaining all of the major plot points of the book. In timing out the film, I discovered that it could be broken down into roughly 10-minute narrative blocks. For every story beat, for example, moving from the girlish Jenny to the adult, then to her becoming Mrs. Isaiah Poster, then to Ephraim Poster's introduction, then to Isaiah's illness and incapacity, and so on, approximately 7 to 10 minutes of screen time elapses. Now, this clockwork efficiency does break down a bit as we get to the climactic parts of the plot, Jenny's seduction of and marriage to John Everett and its tragic results. But there are never any narrative gaps or lags in the story's progression. There are no characters tossed in for no apparent reason, such as the entirely superfluous sex scene in Oppenheimer between the title character and Jean Tatlock, played by Florence Pugh. Don't even get me started on this bit of excess. It's almost as if Nolan wanted to prove that even genius physicists can have interesting adventures in bed. In The Strange Woman, even seemingly peripheral figures serve a narrative and thematic purpose. Clearest example of such a figure in this movie would be the character of Lincoln Pittridge, the fire and brimstone circuit preacher who shows up just long enough to inject an eternal voice into the proceedings. In the novel, Elder Pittridge is a major player in its final third, and is even the title of his own section in the book, a co-equal with the other men in Jenny's busy life, such as Isaiah and Ephraim Poster and John Everett. But this is a movie, not a novel, a distinction I believe some of our current directors and screenwriters need to more appreciate. And in this medium, narrative discipline and mastery count. Thus, Pittridge shows up, delivers his thematically essential chastisement in the church, and exits the stage, or screen, in less than 4 minutes. To dive a bit deeper, the scenes featuring the character of Jean Tatlock in Nolan's Oppenheimer account for nearly 6 minutes of screen time. Also, in response to some criticism of those scenes, especially the relatively explicit sex scene, members of the cast came to Nolan's defense. Cillian Murphy, who played the title character and won an Academy Award for his wonderful performance, was quoted in the press as saying, quote, "The steamy scenes were essential and so effing powerful." Well, I would agree they were effing, but essential and powerful? I beg to differ. I've already hinted at Lamarr's much underrated performance as the Strange Woman. But now I'd like to allude to one scene in particular, because a little voice inside my head is telling me that, at this point in the commentary, some of you listeners to this mini tirade on narrative excess in contemporary movies may be thinking that I have an axe to grind against Christopher Nolan, or that I oppose sex scenes in film. This is not true. As I said earlier, I admire Nolan's talent and have very much liked many of his films, including Oppenheimer. However, this trend toward story bloat is one that I believe lessens the power of feature-length films. This is not to say that there are not stories that warrant long-form treatment. Perhaps the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer is one of them. However, if this is so, then go ahead and make a mini-series. Devote 6 to 8 hours to it, and then demand your audience engage with it for the long haul. That is not a movie in the traditional sense the word has denoted for a century. There is a place for projects like miniseries or docudramas. It's just that, in this critic's opinion, the movie theater is not one of them. Okay, lecture concluded. And now, let's talk about sex, baby. Any Salt and Pepper fans out there? Or am I dating myself? Hedy Lamarr is a sexy woman, and Jenny Hager uses her beauty and wily charms to seduce pretty much every single man she meets in the course of The Strange Woman. However, being a product of coded Hollywood, Edgar Ulmer, his production designer, his director of photography, and his star lead had to be less explicit in their portrayal of this angel and sinner, as the New York Times review of the film dubbed Jenny. Lamarr expertly manages this more subtle but just as powerful sexuality throughout the film, and a great example occurs in her initial dealings with her now son Ephraim, approximately 20 minutes into the picture. This being a DVD, you may wish to take another look at this scene on your own. Following a key scene in the church, in which Jenny exhibits her sly intelligence by embarrassing Isaiah into making a contribution to the pastor, thus establishing her bona fides as a compassionate lady of mercy, we get what may be the clearest demonstration of Jenny's strategy of jumbling men's thoughts, her sinner side. Ephraim has returned home. He addresses Mrs. Poster as mother and moves to place a chaste kiss on her cheek. However, as Jenny, which she reminds Ephraim is still her name, she rejects the innocent peck for a more erotically charged brush over her entire mouth. The movement lasts all of a second, but its implications are strikingly transparent. This will not be your typical mother-son relationship. There are countless instances of such sexiness in the film. It's just that these moments are generated through employing less to achieve more. This exposure of Jenny Hager's angel-sinner dichotomy is masterfully and economically created. So does this make Edgar G. Ulmer a better director than Christopher Nolan? Well, I guess it depends on how you define your terms and what you mean by a great director. However, what I will say is this. Ulmer and his fellow technicians and craftspeople, including Lamarr as both producer and star of the picture, certainly make a tastier lemonade out of their meager lemons, the 2025 equivalent of a $24 million budget, than Nolan does with his much more expensive fruits, usually in the range of $100 million. Interestingly, both Oppenheimer and The Strange Woman were shot in the same number of days, about 60. But while Nolan took the view that more is better, Ulmer and his crew applied the paring knife principle, so typical of the narratively leaner films of yesteryear. The angel-sinner essence of the character Hedy Lamarr plays links her with other femme fatales of the early noir period The Strange Woman comes from, but also distinguishes her from them. I have already mentioned an earlier deadly female from another of Ben Ames Williams's novels adapted for the screen. Ellen Barrent from Leave Her to Heaven, and how she stands firmly on the sinner side of the scale. One also can't help but recall the archetypal man traps found in two genre-defining noirs, the Maltese Falcon's Bridget O'Shaughnessy and Double Indemnity's Phyllis Dietrichson. Each of these women, however, while brilliantly conceived and acted, don't exhibit the thematic complexity of Lamarr's Jenny Hager. Here I will borrow from the excellent commentary Smieszkova provides in her previously alluded to essay. In an analysis of Jenny's seduction of Ephraim after a tense family dinner that follows the distinctly unmotherly kiss Jenny gives her new stepson, the scholar references the dual nature of the character. She calls Jenny beautiful and disquieting, and at the same time, quote, a genuinely complex femme fatale character. Smieszkova nicely describes Jenny's duality, quote, on the one hand, philanthropic saint, and on the other hand, a woman driven by her unbound sexuality. The same could be said of the actress who portrays her, for by 1946, Hedy Lamarr had become a walking dichotomy herself. There was always her almost mythical beauty, which the former Hedwig Kiesler found, at the very least, a great curse as well as a blessing. That alluring exterior encased a brilliant mind, but as Lamarr herself put it, quote, a man does not try to find out what is inside. He does not try to scratch the surface. If he did, he might find something much more beautiful than the shape of a nose or the color of an eye, end quote. In the early 40s, one of those somethings turned out not only to be beautiful, but, in the long run, terribly useful and valuable.
Which of us will he believe?
Jenny, you couldn't. You know what that would do.
He lived a full and useful life. It would be a pity to see him die, but a greater pity to see his life ruined.
With a lie.
We've been living a lie, Ephraim, and I want to be done with it. I want you to return alone.
I think you'd never get here. Where's old man? Where's your father? What happened? What happened?
He make old man die.
No.
We go through swift water. He afraid. He stand up in canoe.
And the canoe turned over. Mr. Poster was too weak to swim. They fought to see which one would get that bailing bucket. I guess you can see who won.
He's dead?
I guess he is, man.
Where's his body?
Must have settled in the quiet water further down. I'm sorry, but we hunted all we could.
I'm sure you did.
That's the whole of it. Except what Mr. Poster here can tell you. If they hear of anything, they'll let you know.
Thank you.
Jenny, believe me, it wasn't my fault. I was afraid. You know how afraid I am of the water.
You can't come into this house, you wretched coward. You killed your father.
By 1940, Hedy Lamarr was a star. By day, she was a cog in the MGM Dream Factory, but by night, she was working her own intellectual cogs. As a girl, Hedy had been fascinated with mechanics. As a 5-year-old, she disassembled a music box and then put it back together again. And as a young woman, she continued her hobby of inventing things. Interestingly enough, it was her beauty that paid for her inventing equipment. One of Lamarr's beaux at the time was Howard Hughes, aircraft designer and eccentric millionaire, and it was he who financed a type of inventor's table in Hedy's home. Instead of attending parties or premieres, Lamarr was at work in her head, coming up with, among other concepts, a better design for an airplane wing and, borrowing a few of Hughes's chemists to create a prototype, a cube that would dissolve in water and make Coca-Cola. But the problem that was most on Hedy's mind was the war in Europe, and one particular aspect of that conflict. Before the U.S. entered World War II, Britain was fighting alone against the force of the Third Reich. One advantage the Germans had was their speedy and agile U-boats, which could easily outmaneuver British ships and their outdated torpedoes. This was personal for Lamarr because her own mother had managed to escape Austria and make it to England. Getting to the safe shores of America, however, was another giant challenge, especially with those U-boats stalking any ship that dared cross the Atlantic. So, the most beautiful woman in the world set her mind to evening the playing field. Her solution was devising a way for ships to securely communicate with a fired torpedo, changing its trajectory as it moved through the water and evading the German torpedoes in order to hit their target, while at the same time making this communication impossible for the U-boats, which would jam it by flooding the sea with radio interference. Lamarr's, quote, profoundly original idea, end quote, as Lamarr biographer Richard Rhodes described it, was what she called frequency hopping. Since this is a film commentary, and I am not a radio communications expert, I can't go into any more detail than that. Despite later critics, who would claim that Lamarr stole the idea, even smuggled it out of Austria well before the war, there is unimpeachable evidence that demonstrates it came from her mind alone. Unfortunately, Hedy did not have the engineering chops to take her idea and turn it into a material reality. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. Among Lamarr's acquaintances in Hollywood at the time was the avant-garde composer George Antheil. His music has been described by conductor Michael Tilson Thomas as, quote, jazz put into a Cuisinart, and he also occupies a place in film history as the composer of the music to the groundbreaking animated short Ballet Mécanique, a 1924 surrealist French short often cited in film literature as a pioneering work in, among other techniques, synchronizing sound and picture. In part, that score was achieved through the synchronization of 16 different player pianos, and it was this technique that George Antheil applied to Hedy Lamarr's frequency hopping notion. Together, they filed a patent for the contraption that they had invented, donated it to the U.S. Inventors Council, and by the summer of 1941, it was presented to the United States Navy, who promptly ignored it and filed it away. Here, my filmic imagination goes to that final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones is told that, quote, top men are working on researching the Ark of the Covenant, when really it is just lying in some government warehouse, packed away in a crate marked top secret. Indy makes a comment about the bureaucratic fools that George Antheil and Hedy Lamarr would probably have sympathized with in 1941. Quote, "They don't know what they've got there," end quote. Indeed, they didn't. In the decades that followed World War II, frequency hopping would be employed in all sorts of ways. Technologies like GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and military satellites are unthinkable without it. And yet, despite some minor recognition coming her way in the final decade of her life, Hedy Lamarr never saw a dime from the product of her fertile mind, masked by that stunning face. Once America goes to war, Hedy Lamarr's brain is not put to any use, but her face and body certainly are. Although not even a U.S. citizen at the time, Lamarr goes on war bond tours and entertains soldiers at the famous Hollywood Canteen. In today's dollars, she sells approximately $343 million worth of war bonds, but no one gives her an opportunity to do anything else in service to her adopted homeland. You can't be Hedy Lamarr and smart. No way, is how the critic Janine Bassinger voices it in the superb 2017 documentary Bombshell, a film I'd highly recommend for anyone listening to this commentary who is interested in finding out more.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Camp 3. Thank you. She's a wonderful woman.
Someday I'm going to pull a bottle out of his hand and bash his head in.
Who are you talking about?
Young Poster. You should hear the things he says about her.
Has he been talking about her? Why, that drunken little... I've seen her nearly sick with worry over what he's doing to himself. Find out where he stays. I want to see him.
Poster, are you in there?
Huh. I must be making trouble. Much more than you're worth.
I'm worth very little. What happens to me now? You beat me up yourself or some of the boys outside?
Come in. Drinks for everybody.
Out there, we're alone.
That's much better. No witnesses. I had witnesses when I killed my father. That made her very angry.
When did you last eat?
I have my food. How do you like your new job, huh?
I like it.
She hasn't got you hooked already, has she?
You'll kill yourself drinking all this stuff without any food inside you. Come on, let's get something to eat. You're doing me out of my dinner. She doesn't know I'm here, and she didn't tell me anything.
That's a lie. No one does anything unless she's back of it. I knew what was going to happen. I was afraid of her. I wanted to leave. She didn't have to worry about that. I wasn't man enough to run away. You in love with her?
I happen to be engaged to someone else.
What difference does that make? Jenny was married to my father. She told me one night she'd marry me if he died. You don't believe a word I say, do you? Go like everybody. No one will believe me.
Go on talking.
The night before we were due to start, she made love to me till I was nearly crazy. You don't believe that either, but it's the truth. I've always been scared of the water. Even when I was a little boy. Jenny knew that. I was scared in the canoe on the trip, and I couldn't eat or sleep anyway from thinking of her. I only remember being in the water with a bailing bucket holding me up, and somebody grabbed for it. I beat him off till he sank and drowned. I didn't know who he was. She's so rotten. You've got to believe me. She's not even a human being. Maybe I did know who he was. I guess I did. She's put the thought in my heart. And if I hadn't done it then, I know I would have later.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You didn't make him love you?
But of course I did. He was my husband's son. I wanted him to love me.
That isn't what he meant.
Was he sober when he told you that?
Jenny, don't you think I know when a man is lying? Before he talks very much more, you better prove that you had nothing to do with him.
Prove? To whom?
To the town.
The town. Is that what you want?
Come back with me to his shack. I want you to face him. Now.
But... the rain. You know what happens to the roads in the rain?
Yes. They get very muddy. But they don't change their direction. Good night.
Oh, no. It isn't that I'm afraid. You mustn't believe him. Please. All right. I'll go.
And speaking of finding out more, let's briefly discuss some of the other contributors to this underrated film, starting with some of the folks behind the camera. The screenplay is credited to Herb Meadow, who spent his childhood in Brooklyn as a runner for bootleggers during Prohibition, and became a prolific writer of scripts, including 350 individual scenarios for a single radio series and 37 feature-length films. As with all movie making, and this is especially true of the assembly line strategy used in most studio-era products, it is impossible to single out what each craftsman pitched in with. But with such a resume, it is not too presumptuous to throw some credit Meadow's way for his distillation of Williams's thick novel into a sleek screen story, which leaves out nothing essential while paring away the fluff. Mr. Meadow, if known at all today, would probably be recognized for his work as a television producer and creator of the successful series Have Gun Will Travel. Film geeks may recall the wonderful scene from Rob Reiner's Stand By Me in 1986, in which the four boys enthusiastically sing that show's theme song while setting off on their own adventure. Have gun will travel reads the card of a man. A knight without armor in a savage land. Having mentioned the European roots of the two main forces behind the making of The Strange Woman, it shouldn't come as a shock that the director of photography on the picture was an émigré as well, but not one from Central Europe. His name was Lucien Andriot. How's my college French pronunciation? Not very good, eh? Well, like director Ulmer and star producer Hedwig Kiesler, Monsieur Andriot has a curious background. Born in Paris, he first comes to America sometime around 1914 and establishes himself in the Eclair moving picture company out of Fort Lee, New Jersey. Okay, time for another edifying tangent now. This is the same studio that tragically burned down in 1914 and which was the home of the Solax Company, the largest pre-Hollywood studio. Now, Solax was founded by Alice Guy Blaché, and the fire pretty much ruined her career and saw the destruction of many of her films. Blaché has a weird connection to Hedy Lamarr in a way, because she too was a woman in a man's world. As Lamarr would do 30 years later, in the earliest years of the film industry in France, and then later on the East Coast of the United States, Blaché was a female movie maker. Much more could and should be said of Alice Guy Blaché, but I'll simply refer you to another fantastic documentary, made only a year after the one I just recommended. It's called Be Natural, The Untold Story of Alice Guy Blaché. Gosh, my poor French is getting a workout on this track. At any rate, the cinematographer Andriot moved on to Hollywood in 1920 and worked for the Fox studio, which included shooting an early John Wayne Western, The Big Trail, in 1930. There was an entire French colony within Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, just like the Jewish one, but smaller. And Andriot often worked with its directors, men like René Clair and Jean Renoir. And, in one more side note to demonstrate just how small the classic Hollywood world was, he shot 2 features with George Sanders, who plays a major role in The Strange Woman, and about whom I'll talk soon. Finally, about the minor players, let's take a quick look at the film's production designer and art director. His name is Nikolai Remesov, and as you might imagine, he was Russian. But what a remarkable life! He was born in St. Petersburg, served a stint in the Russian army during World War I, then co-founded a satirical political magazine called Satyricon, where he published hundreds of political cartoons and caricatures. The Bolsheviks did not find Remesov's work amusing and attempted to bring him to trial. Remesov and his family fled Russia, where they ultimately arrived in Paris in 1921. There, he became the artistic director of a famed theater company, which brought him to the United States. In New York, Remesov began designing covers and doing illustrations for such publications as Vanity Fair and Vogue. In 1922, he had a one-man show at the Wildenstein Gallery. He then met beauty maven Elizabeth Arden, who asked him to design her famed Red Door salon and spa. In 1924, Remesov opened a Russian-themed nightclub in New York called Club Petrushka, which became the place to be seen and was frequented by such notables as George and Ira Gershwin, Harpo Marx, and Rudolph Valentino, among others. In 1925, the club caught fire, and the manager of the club perished in the incident. After the demise of his club, Remesov headed to Chicago, where he taught stage design at the Art Institute from 1925 to 1926. During his Chicago tenure, he designed sets and costumes for ballet companies and created murals for various public spaces like casinos and libraries. He was even commissioned to decorate State Street for the Thanksgiving parade in 1931. He had one-man shows at the Arts Club of Chicago in 1925 and the Art Institute of Chicago in 1938. Remesov left Chicago for Hollywood in 1938 and became an art director. Throughout his career, he was the art or production designer for 31 movies, including Of Mice and Men and the first Ocean's 11 picture. Remesov's design style was so unique that it became known as, quote, Russian Vogue, end quote. Now, I highlight this man to represent a theme I have already mentioned, which can be seen throughout studio-era Hollywood. The amazing range of talent that came out of the ruins of European culture and made its way to the United States in the interwar years. Like Hedy Lamarr and Edgar G. Ulmer, Remesov was an accomplished artist in the cultural capitals of Europe before escaping to America. And here are all these people working together on what is basically a minor film from 1946.
I didn't want it to happen like this, Meg. I wanted to be the one to tell you.
I don't see what difference it would make. It's the same story, isn't it?
I suppose so.
When will you be married?
Right away?
In Bangor?
I don't know. Jenny will take care of the details.
I saw this happening a long time ago. There was nothing I could do about it. She's waiting for you.
Jenny, how could you do a thing like that?
I thought if you came here alone, you wouldn't come back to me.
this small world continues as I'll now turn to the two male leads of the film. George Sanders is mostly known today for his snooty British accent and roles as sophisticated sleazeballs, probably the most prominent one being the caustic and ruthless theater critic Addison DeWitt in All About Eve, for which he won an Oscar. However, hard as it may be to believe, he was born and lived the first 11 years of his life in St. Petersburg, Russia. Yes, that's exactly the same city that the aforementioned Nikolai Remesov was born and raised in. And like Remesov, the Sanders family fled Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution. I wonder if, between takes on the set of The Strange Woman, Remesov and Sanders reminisced about their motherland. He attended private schools in England and then traveled to South America, where in the late 20s he managed a tobacco plantation. The Depression sent him back to England and work at an advertising agency, whose secretary thought he'd make a good actor and encouraged him to pursue that dream. That secretary's name? Greer Garson, who would go on to become a legendary actress in her own right, starring in, among others, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and William Wyler's wartime classic, Mrs. Miniver. After some stage work in Britain and New York, Sanders signed a standard 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox. It's curious that the term of those contracts was set at 7 years, the same time required of the longest indentured servants of the past. By the time of his playing John Everett, Jenny Hager's ultimate prey and her second husband, Sanders had established himself as a solid performer, including appearances in 2 early Alfred Hitchcock pictures, Rebecca and Foreign Correspondent. His most high-profile roles, however, would come after The Strange Woman, including the big-budget Forever Amber, he played King Charles II, and the biblical epic Samson and Delilah, where he would share the screen again with Hedy Lamarr. Finally, it is interesting that in the late 30s, Sanders took over the role of the Saint from our next actor, Lewis Hayward. In keeping with our international theme, Hayward was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, while it was still a British colony, and educated in both France and England. Never a major star, he worked steadily for 20 years between 1935 and 1955. In yet another strange connection, Hayward was married to Ida Lupino for 7 years until 1945. I referenced Lupino earlier in the commentary. She is generally considered the first woman to go from acting to working behind the camera, both as producer and director. However, as you now know, Hedy Lamarr did her pioneering work as producer a good 2 years before Lupino. And prior to moving on to our final actor, may I make one more recommendation? Before both Lamarr and Ida Lupino, another woman broke into the men's club that was Hollywood film production in the 30s and 40s. That woman's name was Dorothy Arzner, who directed her best film, Dance Girl Dance, in 1940. That movie's male lead? None other than Lewis Hayward. However, he is outshined by the 2 female leads, Lucille Ball and Maureen O'Hara. That title again is Dance Girl Dance, another obscure gem, just like this movie.
That house. Why do you want to go on living in it?
Oh, but it's a good house, John. It'll stand for a long time. At least until we know just where to build another.
Well, I'm not finicky about where it'll be. I just think you want to go on living in that old tomb. What do you say, Jenny? Should we start building our own house?
But that is our house.
Belongs to Isaiah Poster. Let him keep it.
Oh, but he's dead and he left it to me.
Belongs to him and his son, and it's full to the roof with sorrows. I want to get out of it. I want new rooms and more of them. For the sake of our children, I want light and air.
There are enough rooms now.
Which isn't the right house, Jenny. It's too close to Devil's Half-Acre. It isn't the place to bring up children.
There won't be any children.
Nonsense.
Is it? Ask Dr. Bailey, he'll tell you.
Seems there are some things we haven't talked about. When did you learn this?
Some time ago.
What exactly did Bailey say?
Oh, I don't remember. Makes a lot of difference, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Between us.
Doesn't make any difference at all. There are many things a husband and wife can live for.
That's very sensible, but I wonder what you'll think in a few years from now.
I'll think that you're more beautiful than ever, and that I love you very much.
Oh, look. There's Lincoln Pettridge.
The current commentary you're listening to is my third, and I wouldn't even mention this if it weren't for a discovery I made in my study of the strange woman. About 90 minutes into the picture, the key figure of Lincoln Pettridge makes his first appearance. He shows up immediately after Jenny has admitted to John that she can't have children, and John reassures her that, besides children, quote, there are many things that a husband and wife can live for, end quote. At last, it seems that Jenny might achieve happiness, that she may be allowed to entirely transform from sinner to angel. But into this domestic bliss comes a fly in the ointment, an itinerant preacher who, like some prophet out of the Old Testament, will hold up a mirror to Jenny and force her to face her sinner self. In an arresting scene in the church, something out of Puritan New England, the buckskin-clad preacher has apparently apprehended a fornicating couple and has them facing the congregation while he attacks the morals of the entire community. He seemingly channels figures out of the American Puritan past, such as Jonathan Edwards, whose notorious sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, brought men and women to their knees, as Pettridge does here. However, the preacher saves his most damning accusatory arrows for Jenny, pointing his gnarled finger directly at her. She will never recover. He sets in motion the narrative machinery that leads to her death. This scene is remarkable in its effect, and it is in no small part due to the actor playing the preacher and Jenny Hager's personal scourge. The first time I saw the movie, I knew I had seen that actor before. He looked incredibly familiar, but his voice was even more recognizable. And then it came to me. That's Ian Keith. Who, you may be asking? Well, he played Vitamin Flintheart in the RKO B picture Dick Tracy vs. Cue Ball, the first film I provided a commentary to. Both that movie and this one were made in the same year, and Keith manages the same accomplishment I noted in his earlier turn, the spell that he casts with relatively few lines. It is said that Chester Gould, the creator of the Dick Tracy comic strip, based Vitamin Flintheart, the character Keith played, on John Barrymore, the so-called great profile, and lauded by one critic as, quote, the greatest living American tragedian, end quote. In my opinion, Keith was doing an impression of Barrymore in his portrayal of Vitamin, and he does something similar here in his role as Lincoln Pettridge, but to a different purpose, not comic, but dramatic. It is in the preacher's soliloquy that the film is brought full circle and its theme of angel-sinner reaches its climax. As Jenny listens to this voice of God, she looks as if she is pinned to her seat, hypnotized by the truth. In his summation, the preacher delivers the verdict on Jenny Hager. Quote, your beauty has made you evil, and evil destroys itself. You can never escape. And indeed, Jenny doesn't escape her dilemma, at least not alive. But could the same be said of Hedy Lamarr? In a way, sadly, yes.
He's not any better than the people he talks about.
No, he's right. The town is becoming a sinkhole.
That horrible man. To say to me what he did.
He wasn't talking to you. He was talking to people like Lena. Jenny, I've come to a decision. We're going to put Lena out of your house.
No.
I don't care what she meant to you when you were a child. I'm talking about what she is now. I don't want you to be connected with her.
Why not? In what way is she different from us? Except that she's more honest.
She goes out of your house tomorrow. I don't want her sins on your hands.
You good, righteous man. You hypocrite. Telling others what they must and must not do while you live in this house with me. Do you know what went on in this room before Ephraim killed his father?
Jenny.
Do you remember the things he said about me? You said he was drunk and afraid. Of course he was afraid. We're all afraid. There's hell opening under our feet.
Jenny.
This is where he sat. Sit down, John, and I'll show you how I made him kill his father. Sit down and I'll kiss you the way I kissed him. Why do you look at me like that? Why do you pretend everything he told you was true and you knew it? You knew it! Oh, I don't know what I'm saying. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Go to bed, Jenny. Please go to bed.
John, is Mrs. Hollis back from church? John, it's time for bed. John, please forget what I said. You know I couldn't have done it.
I never believed it. I tried not to believe it.
Because you love me. You still do.
Yes.
Darling, don't be unhappy. We know each other now, and that's good. There'll be no more misunderstandings, no more quarrels. Oh, darling, there'll be just the two of us.
No, there won't. There'll be three. There'll always be Ephraim.
Oh, come in.
Mary, I'm looking for Mr. Everett. I thought he might be with Reverend Thatcher.
Father isn't here right now, but if you'd like to wait...
Oh, no, thank you. I have no time. Good morning. Is Miss Saladin home?
No, Mrs. Everett. She went out.
Has Mr. Everett been here?
Oh, no, I haven't seen him.
Thank you.
Oh, I thought it was Mr. Everett.
Do you know where he is?
He didn't come in here, ma'am. I slept here last night on account of the rain, and you're the first one in. Mr. Everett tells me you're sending a school teacher up to every camp with more than 2 families. That's a handsome thing to do, ma'am. Guess you're mighty fond of children.
Duncan, who did sleep here last night? Was it you or Mr. Everett?
Ma'am, I told you. Oh, that's just another one he has. He sometimes...
He wore this hat when he brought me home from church last night, and he wore it again when he went out for a walk. Now, why aren't you supposed to tell me where he is?
You put me in an awful fix, ma'am. I promised him...
Duncan, he isn't well. Couldn't you see that? What good is a promise to a sick man when it keeps his wife from helping him?
Is that the trouble with him? I kind of thought he looked funny around the eyes.
Where is he?
Well, I'm not telling you, mind you, but that'd be the wrong kind of hat to wear up in the pine country.
Where in the pine country?
Fire watcher's cabin. Indian Hill.
When will he be back?
I don't know. 2, 3 days, I guess. Said he wanted to go up there and think a while. Oh, I got a loose mouth. That's my trouble. Makes 2 people I told where he is.
Who is the other?
Miss Saladin.
Miss Saladin.
Came in here about an hour ago and dug it out of me just like you did. Said she saw him last night alone. Acted like something was wrong. Next time he trusts me with anything, it'll...
It was very good of you to come up here, Meg. But there's really nothing you can do to help me. No one can help me but myself.
The Strange Woman stands as evidence of Hedy's talents, both as producer and actress. Even with the disadvantage of an accent she never could quite shake, Lamarr is quite good in the film. After this rather auspicious start as a producer and molder of her own image, Lamarr would go on to make only one other independent picture, Dishonored Lady, in 1947. It, too, went over budget, but did not make a profit. So, in 1949, desperate for money and, one would guess, some attention, Lamarr goes back to what the world had prescribed for her. She stars as another biblical Jezebel, Delilah, but without the complexity of Jenny Hager's Strange Woman. Cecil B. DeMille's Sex and Sand epic, Samson and Delilah, is a huge success. In 1950, it was Hollywood's 3rd highest-grossing film of all time. But at what professional and personal cost to its star? Lamarr would attempt to copy the success of Samson and Delilah with her own version of a similar story, Loves of Three Queens, shot entirely in Europe in 1954. But it is a failure and bankrupts her. She marries 3 more times and, in a vain and desperate attempt to maintain her physical beauty, starts to have plastic surgery in her 40s. In a cruel irony, her inventive mind leads her to devise methods that were viewed at the time as groundbreaking and became industry standards for years afterwards. By the end of her life, she refused to leave her apartment. The home movies that appear in the documentary Bombshell are literally horrific. The elderly Hedy recalling a creature resembling Frankenstein's monster. A Forbes magazine article comes out in 1990 telling the story of her intellectual curiosity and frequency-hopping invention. And she does even receive an award from the Navy and Lockheed Martin recognizing her contribution to modern communications in 1997. She refused to attend and be seen in public, however. The beauty had slayed the brain. Still, in some way, The Strange Woman serves as proof that balance between the two is possible. It preserves the Hedy Lamarr, who was both brilliant and beautiful at the same time.
I love you more than ever.
I wanted so many things. I wanted the whole world. But it was really only you.
Jenny. Jenny.